Hey everyone, and welcome. Before we dive deep into the strange world of medieval mental health, take a second to hit that like button if you enjoy these deep dives into history's odd corners. And subscribe if you want to join us for the full journey. We've got a long, fascinating story ahead. Seriously, let me know in the comments right now, where are you watching from and what time is it there? I love seeing how far this community spreads. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on medieval popular psychology. This was the ancient science of confidently diagnosing your deepest emotions as plumbing problems and then treating them with tools better suited for a barnyard. It's a world where sadness wasn't an emotion, it was a substance you could, in theory, drain. Where thinking too hard was a diagnosable health risk. But to understand why they believed this, we have to step into their reality. Our story starts not in the dim candlelight of a monastery, but centuries earlier, in the sun-baked markets of ancient Greece. The medieval mind didn't invent its ideas about psychology. It inherited a broken system and then ran with it for 1,000 years. The core framework was the theory of the four humors, proposed by the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates and later cemented by the Roman doctor Galen. They posited that the human body contained four key fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was a perfect, delicate balance of these humors. Personality and emotion were just byproducts of which fluid was dominant. A sanguine person, cheerful and social, had too much blood. A phlegmatic person, sluggish and calm, was ruled by phlegm. Choleric, angry, and ambitious? That was yellow bile. But the star of our show, the humor that truly captured the medieval imagination for its mystery and menace, was black bile. In Greek, melos meant black, and chol meant bile. Melancholy. This wasn't just a mood. It was a tangible, cold, dry, heavy substance imagined to be pooling in your spleen and stomach, sloshing around like emotional tar. The ancients had a problem, though. Nobody could ever actually find this black bile during dissections or surgeries. It was a theoretical fluid, a placeholder explanation for the profound and often terrifying experience of deep sadness. But by the time this idea filtered down through Arabic scholars like Avicenna, whose medical texts became European Bibles, and into the hands of medieval doctors, it was treated as concrete, irrefutable fact. So, in the medieval mind, sadness was not grief. It was not a reasonable response to living in a world of famine, plague, war, and toothaches with no anesthesia. It was not the weight of losing a child, a spouse, or your entire harvest to a sudden frost. No. Your despair was a fluid problem. Your internal weather system had failed. If you felt a lingering gloom, a tendency to brood, to withdraw, to what physicians politely called engage in excessive thought, the diagnosis was simple and swift. You were full of bile. The treatment logic followed with a brutal elegance. Remove the bile. How? Through what they called evacuation. Bloodletting was the gold standard. The logic was that bad blood carried the bad humors. So they'd open a vein, often at the elbow, and drain you, sometimes into a purpose-made bowl with measurements marked on the side to track how much melancholy had been extracted. If bleeding didn't work, or to augment it, they induced violent vomiting with potent herbs like hellebore. They prescribed powerful laxatives. They made you sweat in intense baths or wrapped in heavy blankets. They starved you, believing fasting would dry up the excess moisture of the humors. Sometimes, you'd get all of these in one memorable, exhausting afternoon. Medieval medicine essentially looked at emotional exhaustion and said, "What if we make you physically miserable too, and see which one breaks first?" Doctors took this incredibly seriously. They weren't just checking your pulse. They were conducting psychological assessments through bodily observation. A 12th century text from the school of Salerno would advise physicians to note how often a patient sighed, for sighing was the smoke of a melancholic heart. They tracked sleep patterns not for rest quality, but for signs of moist or dry sleep. They analyzed your posture, your gaze. A person who stared thoughtfully into the middle distance, who was quiet and introspective, was considered in more danger than someone screaming in rage. Silence meant the black bile was settling, thickening, and consolidating its hold. Grief was processed through this same grim filter. If your spouse died, the community might offer prayers, but the physician, if you could afford one, offered a blade and a bowl. Comfort was a spiritual matter. The physical illness of melancholy caused by the shock of loss was a medical one. The goal wasn't to work through the emotion, but to physically drain it from the system as if it were a poison. This created a terrifying bind for creative people. Poets, artists, scholars, philosophers, anyone whose work required deep introspection, were considered prime candidates for melancholy. Their natural state was the disease state. A 14th century English writer, John of Murfield, would warn that students who studied through the night risked drying out their brains and inviting the black bile to take root. Creativity was tolerated only in small, controlled doses. Too much imagination heated the brain, which then, paradoxically, caused it to cool and dry, the perfect condition for black bile production. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. You thought deeply, which made you sad, which proved you had black bile, which required treatment that often left you weaker, more depressed, or dead. And here's the perverse genius of the system. If you survived the bleeding and purging, the doctor declared a success. The treatment had removed the excess humor. If you didn't survive, well, the problem of your melancholy was also technically resolved. The system was airtight, absolving itself of failure. In an odd, desperate way, turning sadness into a physical substance made it feel controllable. You couldn't understand your grief, but you could quantify it in ounces of blood lost. You couldn't heal your mind, but you could weaken your body until you were too tired to feel anything at all. It was a heartbreaking trade, but for a millennium it was the only trade on offer. The tragedy, of course, is that black bile never existed. And bleeding a sad person doesn't cure despair. It usually just makes them anemic and sad. But medieval psychology didn't know that, and it was breathtakingly, unshakably confident. That confidence is what we'll keep running into as this story unfolds. Now, if medieval psychology's take on sadness seems harsh, just wait until you hear what they had to say about thinking itself. After firmly blaming melancholy on an imaginary fluid, scholars turned their gaze inward to the act of thought and reached a startling conclusion. Thinking was not a virtue, not a path to enlightenment, but a form of risky behavior. Not dangerous in a philosophical questioning authority sense, but in a literal medical your brain might overheat and ruin your life sense. Reflection, deep analysis, prolonged concentration, these were all classified as genuine health hazards. To understand why, we have to look at their model of the brain. Medieval science, borrowing from Galen again, saw the brain not as a complex network, but as a delicate, soft, and crucially moist organ. It was the body's radiator, its purpose to cool the fiery heart. But this made it vulnerable. The prevailing belief was that intense mental activity generated actual physical heat. If you thought too much, you risked drying out this precious, moist brain. A dried brain was a brittle brain. A brittle brain led to confusion, forgetfulness, and ultimately madness. This wasn't a metaphor. Medical texts, like the popular Te Queenum Sanitatis, warned explicitly that too much study dried the brain and could bring on frenzy. So, moderation wasn't just advised. It was prescribed. You were encouraged to think just enough to do your job, say your prayers, and not ask too many follow-up questions. Curiosity was tolerated only briefly before it was monitored closely. Consider the medieval university student. He was told that reading late into the night by candlelight was a double threat. First, the act of study heated the brain. Second, The smoke and fumes from the candle would further dry and damage it. The recommended study breaks weren't for a quick snack, but for long walks, sleep, or listening to light music, activities that would cool and re-moisten the mind. Imagine being told that learning Latin grammar or debating Aristotle was as medically risky as working in a forge. This created a pervasive anxiety around education, especially for certain groups. Women, according to this moist brain model, were in particular peril. Their bodies were believed to be naturally colder and wetter than men's. A woman's brain, therefore, was already in a state of precarious moisture. Serious intellectual thought could overheat this cold, wet organ, causing a dangerous imbalance. This meant education for women wasn't just socially discouraged. It was framed as medically irresponsible. A 15th century guide, the Book of the Knight of the Tower, warned noblewomen that too much reading could damage their complexions and their wits. The restriction was sold as protection. We're not limiting you, the logic went, we're preserving your delicate physiological balance. But the group most suspect under this regime were the philosophers and theologians. Medieval society admired them in theory. The great thinkers like Thomas Aquinas were revered, but in practice, anyone who made a habit of deep, abstract thought was seen as courting insanity. The archetype of the absent-minded, melancholic scholar comes directly from this period. If you were often caught staring into space, people didn't think you were having a brilliant insight. They assumed your brain was overheating, cooking itself from the inside, and quietly rearranging itself into chaos. This fear even extended into sleep. Dreams were not seen as random neural firings. Vivid, intense dreams meant your imagination, housed in a specific chamber at the front of the brain, was running unchecked while you slept, a sure sign of mental imbalance. Sleep was supposed to be a passive, cooling, restorative process. If your mind was still active, creating stories and images, it meant your mental dampers were failing. You weren't resting. You were slowly drying out your own mind from within. The safest mental state, according to this psychology, was a mild, obedient awareness. Think a little, feel a little, never too much of either. Passion of any kind, intellectual or emotional, was suspect because it generated heat. Modern psychology encourages introspection and cognitive engagement. Medieval psychology, looking at the same act, essentially encouraged a nap. And honestly, given the constant stress, poor nutrition, and very real brain ailments of the time, maybe don't think too hard was the most accidentally healthy advice they ever gave. It was a psychology designed not to explore the mind, but to keep it quiet, cool, and under control. Because once they decided thinking could cook your brain, they quickly identified the next emotional fire hazard, anger. And they had a perfectly humid explanation for that, too. So medieval psychology had sadness down as a drainage issue and thinking as a cooling problem. The next emotional wildfire they tried to contain was anger. And their diagnosis, it wasn't about injustice, frustration, or the grinding stress of feudal life. No, anger was a case of internal combustion. Specifically, it was your liver throwing a tantrum. According to the humor system, anger sprang from an excess of yellow bile or choler. This was a hot, dry substance produced, they believed, by the liver. If you were calm, your liver was temperate and well-behaved. If you were furious, your liver was essentially overheating like a poorly ventilated furnace, boiling that yellow bile and sending its fiery vapors up to the heart and brain. Emotional regulation, therefore, wasn't about mindfulness or resolving conflict. It was a form of metabolic temperature management. Your rage had nothing to do with your lord raising taxes, your neighbor stealing your pig, or the sheer impossibility of getting anything done in a world without deadlines. Just eventually. You were angry because your organs were too warm. The solution was as literal as the diagnosis. Cool the body, calm the bile, and tell your liver to stand down. Treatments were predictably physical. Icy cold baths were a favorite, literally trying to douse the internal fire. Cooling diets were prescribed, avoiding spices, red meat, alcohol, and anything considered heating, and, of course, bloodletting. Because if the problem was too much hot, bilious blood, the answer was to open a vein and let some out. Medieval medicine really did think bleeding was the answer to almost everything. Physicians like Arnold of Villanova, a 13th century scholar, wrote detailed guides on which vein to open based on the patient's temperament and the season, all to balance these fiery humors. But the advice went beyond diet and phlebotomy. If you had a temper, you were told to avoid excitement of any kind. Avoid arguments. Avoid competitive games. Avoid, essentially, anything that made life interesting or worth living. The goal was a state of cool, damp blandness. Medieval psychology believed chronic anger could physically warp your personality. Constantly angry people were described in medical texts as sharp, bitter, prickly, and difficult. Descriptions that, to be fair, aren't entirely off the mark even today. But instead of exploring the roots of that bitterness, the treatment was to reduce the patient's inner heat until they were too physically depleted to be prickly. This theory also served to reinforce social hierarchies, especially around gender. Men, being naturally hotter and drier, were believed more prone to choleric rage. This conveniently explained and even excused male violence as a simple matter of biology. A lord's furious outburst was just his liver working overtime. A woman's body, being colder and wetter, was thought to be less susceptible to pure anger. Unless, of course, her moisture levels went awry, in which case her emotions could flood in a different direction. Towards hysteria, a condition literally named for the wandering womb they believed caused it. Medieval psychology was remarkably proud of how neatly it could slot every human behavior into a humor-based box, while understanding almost nothing of the actual human experience. Even righteous anger was medically discouraged. A man who shouted too passionately about a wrong wasn't seen as principled. He was dysgraphic. His humors were out of balance. A woman who expressed anger at all was, well, that was a separate and more alarming problem, often involving whispers of witchcraft or demonic influence, requiring clerical intervention rather than medical. This medicalization had real-world consequences, especially in legal settings. In some medieval courts, a display of anger could be introduced as evidence of poor health rather than bad character. If you lashed out, the assumption might not be that you were morally wrong, but that your liver needed intervention. Accountability was optional. A cooling regimen was mandatory. It created a bizarre loophole where physiology could excuse behavior. Modern psychology understands anger as a complex emotional response to perceived threats or injustices with deep evolutionary roots. Medieval psychology saw it as a plumbing and heating malfunction. If only all our emotional crises could be solved with fewer peppers and a nice, long soak in a cold stream. But the medieval mind wasn't done. After confidently assigning sadness to the spleen and anger to the liver, it turned its diagnostic gaze to the most celebrated of human feelings. And in a move that should surprise no one by now, it looked at love, that pinnacle of poetry and song, and declared it a diagnosable illness. A temporary, dangerous fever best handled, once again, by someone with a sharp knife and a steady hand. The story of how they pathologized romance is where this gets truly strange. So if you're enjoying this historical deep dive, let me know in the comments what's been the wildest part for you so far. And don't forget to like and subscribe to follow this continuous story. We're about to see what happened when medieval doctors decided that falling in love was a clinical condition, one they called lovesickness, and treated with the same urgency as the plague. After pathologizing sadness and anger, medieval psychology faced its greatest challenge yet: explaining love. And in a breathtaking display of reductionism, it did exactly what you'd expect. It declared love not romantic, not poetic, not a profound connection, but a diagnosable illness. A temporary, dangerous fever best handled by a physician with a blade and a bowl. This condition had a formal name, amorhurios or lovesickness, and scholars from Constantinople to Oxford treated it with the grave seriousness usually reserved for outbreaks of plague. The symptoms, as detailed in medical texts like Constantine the African's 11th century Viaticum, were meticulously catalogued. Falling in love caused palpitations, insomnia, a dramatic loss of appetite, obsessive thinking, unexplained sighing, and an alarming tendency to stare at nothing while smiling faintly. In other words, medieval psychology accurately described the universal experience of being head over heels in love and then decided it was a pathology. Doctors believed love violently disrupted the balance of the humors. It overheated the heart, dried the brain with obsessive thoughts, and sent the body's vital spirits racing in chaotic patterns. Passion was literally a fever. The symptoms were so well known they became cultural tropes. A lovesick knight in a romance might waste away, refusing food, composing bad poetry. But in the real world, this wasn't charming. It was a medical emergency. If a blacksmith's apprentice became so distracted by thoughts of a merchant's daughter that he ruined a piece of iron, his problem wasn't romantic frustration. It was a humor imbalance requiring intervention. Treatment was varied, and none of it involved happiness or fulfillment. Cold baths were, again, a frontline prescription. The logic was unshakable. If love was a heat, it could be quenched. Bloodletting was also popular. If you were thinking too much about your beloved, the theory went, blood had rushed to your heart and brain, causing congestion. Removing blood would relieve the pressure. Dietary changes were enforced. Bland, cooling foods. Lettuce, cucumbers, barley water. No spices, no wine, no rich meats. And absolutely no contact with the person you loved. Exposure therapy was not part of the plan. Elimination of the stimulus was. In more severe or hopeless cases, doctors might advise marriage, not as a celebration of love, but as a form of containment. If the object of affection was unavailable, the solution was aggressive distraction. Travel, intense physical labor, prayer, and constant supervision were all prescribed. Feelings were not to be explored or processed. They were to be redirected, like diverting an inconvenient stream. The double standard was stark. Women diagnosed with lovesickness were often treated as emotionally unstable, their feelings proof of a naturally cooler, wetter, and more susceptible constitution. A lovesick woman might be prescribed sedatives and confined. Men with the same diagnosis were seen as temporarily foolish, their hot blood led astray. The treatment aimed to restore their reason, not necessarily to cure their hearts. The most tragic aspect of this medicalization is that love was only socially acceptable when it was quiet, controlled, and channeled into proper channels like procreation within marriage. Passion, longing, obsession, or desire outside of that narrow frame was deeply suspicious. Love was permitted only in small, regulated doses like a dangerous medicine. This created a world where one of the most fundamental human experiences was framed as a threat to bodily and social order. Modern psychology might see love as a complex interplay of attachment, chemistry, and social bonding. Medieval psychology saw it as a humoral fever, a thermodynamic crisis. And like all medieval fevers, the presumed solution was to drain or cool something until the patient stopped behaving strangely. It was a heartbreakingly clinical response to the heart's deepest mysteries. But the medieval diagnostic machine was just warming up. Having explained sadness, anger, and love as fluid and temperature problems, it now needed a grand unifying theory for why some people seemed more emotionally volatile than others. And it found the perfect scapegoat, one that reinforced every existing social prejudice. It turned its gaze to half the human population, nodded sagely, and said, "Yes, The problem is them. Specifically, it was their moisture. Having confidently assigned love to the category of curable fevers, medieval psychology needed a broader theory to explain why emotional turbulence seemed, to their eyes, unevenly distributed. They found their answer not in circumstance or power, but in elemental composition. And they laid the blame squarely on one group: women. According to the rigorous science of the time, women were more emotional not because their lives were constrained, dangerous, and exhausting, though they were, but because they were fundamentally wetter and colder. Psychologically soggy. This wasn't casual sexism, it was a formal medical doctrine. Medieval thinkers held that the ideal human temperament was hot and dry. Dryness meant stability, solidity, rational thought. Heat meant active energy and vitality. Men, conveniently, were described as naturally hotter and drier. This explained their presumed rationality, authority, and fitness for public life and leadership. Women, by contrast, were classified as colder and wetter. This moisture, according to authorities like Galen and his medieval interpreters, caused innate instability. Emotions in a cold, wet body were like water in a shaky bowl. They sloshed around, spilled over, and refused to stay put. Thoughts couldn't set properly. Reason failed to harden. The female mind, like damp bread, was prone to mold and unpredictable fermentation. This moisture theory provided a perfect, self-reinforcing explanation for everything medieval society already believed. A woman crying? That was just excess moisture escaping, a physical purge. A woman expressing anger? That was improper fluid distribution, a local heating of cold humors. A woman demonstrating intelligence? It was possible but risky. Too much thinking could overheat her already damp brain, causing it to either dry out dangerously or stew in its own vapors, leading to hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis derived from the Greek word for womb, hystra, which they believed could wander around the body causing trouble. As a result, education for women wasn't just considered unnecessary, it was medically questionable. Intellectual activity might imbalance their delicate humors. Reading romances could overheat their imaginations. Even devout religious ecstasy, common among medieval holy women, was often viewed with suspicion by male clerics. Was this divine passion or just another example of moist, unstable humors boiling over? Medical texts framed restriction as protection. We're not limiting you, the logic went, we're preserving your fragile physiological equilibrium. Strong emotions in women were dangerous not because they were powerful, but because they disrupted this precarious moisture balance. Emotional regulation wasn't encouraged. Emotional containment was the goal. This belief was reinforced by women's unique biological experiences. Menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth were interpreted not as complex biological processes, but as stark evidence that women were fundamentally governed by fluids. This made them seem mysterious, unpredictable, and therefore inherently suspicious. Their bodies were seen as leaky, changeable, and less finished than the solid, dry male form. In this way, psychology became the ultimate excuse for social hierarchy. What a woman felt could be dismissed as a flux. What she said could be attributed to vapors rising from her womb to her brain. Her desires and complaints could be pathologized out of existence. What these scholarly men never considered or deliberately ignored was the obvious. Perhaps women were emotional because their lives were legally subordinate, physically perilous due to constant childbirth, and offered little autonomy. Maybe tears were a reasonable response to a world where you had almost no control over your body, property, or destiny. But exploring that idea would have required empathy and a critical look at social structures, and medieval popular psychology was far more comfortable with imaginary fluids than inconvenient truths. This moisture-based model was insidious because it was so totalizing. It explained everything and justified everything. It turned difference into defect, and then used that defect to enforce control. Modern psychology recognizes emotion as a universal human experience, influenced by a million factors from genetics to culture. Medieval psychology, when it looked at women, simply pointed to the weather inside them and called it a day. And somehow, this damp explanation survived for centuries, proving once again that confident, simple wrongness is often more persuasive than messy, complex truth. But the medieval quest for external explanations wasn't over. If fluids and temperature couldn't explain every strange thought or dream, there were other, more distant forces to blame. After finishing with women, medieval psychology looked upward, past the damp human body, past the earthly realm, and fixed its gaze on the night sky. It reached one of its most enduring and poetic conclusions. If your mind was a mess, it wasn't your fault, your fluids, or your gender. The planets did it. Once medieval psychology had exhausted earthly explanations, blaming emotions on fluids, temperature, and the inherent sogginess of women, it turned its gaze skyward, and it arrived at what it considered the most elegant, irrefutable explanation of all. Your personality, your moods, your very sanity were not fully your own. They were written in the stars. According to a belief that spanned from the lecture halls of Paris to the markets of Baghdad, the position of celestial bodies at the moment of your birth didn't just influence your life. It installed your psychological firmware. This wasn't metaphorical. Mars didn't just symbolize aggression. It physically channeled a hot, dry, choleric essence into your soul. Saturn, distant and cold, didn't suggest melancholy. It was the direct delivery system for black bile, signed, sealed, and guaranteed. Your mind was leased from the cosmos. Astrology in this period was not fringe superstition. It was mainstream psychology, fully integrated into medicine and natural philosophy. Scholars, physicians, and even many clergy agreed that the heavens shaped human thought and temperament as predictably as the moon pulled the tides. The 10th century Persian polymath al-Biruni wrote exhaustive astrological texts that would later be translated and poured over in Europe. If you were anxious and mercurial, the planet Mercury was in a bad mood. If you were bold and violent, Mars was ascendant. If you were gripped by a profound, creative sadness, Saturn had parked itself in your astrological house. And if your entire life was falling apart, congratulations, you were simply born under an unfortunate conjunction of planets. Birth charts were treated as detailed psychological profiles. Physicians would consult them before making a diagnosis, believing the planetary alignments could tell them if a patient was prone to phlegmatic lethargy or choleric rage. Kings consulted astrologers before launching wars or signing treaties. Parents might use charts to explain why one child was serene and another was, as we might say, a handful. The beauty of this system was its flawless absolution. Your temper wasn't your fault. Your depression wasn't your fault. Your terrible life choices weren't your fault. They were celestial destiny. Accountability floated somewhere between Jupiter and the void. This went beyond explanation into the realm of practical treatment. Medical astrology dictated that certain days, governed by specific planets, were better for procedures. Bloodletting, for instance, was to be avoided when the moon was in a sign associated with a particular bodily fluid, lest you drain the wrong humor. Performing surgery under the wrong planetary alignment could, they believed, worsen the condition, an impressive feat considering how grim medieval surgery already was. This belief also introduced a sense of fated unpredictability. Your emotional stability could wax and wane not with your life events, but with the celestial clockwork. You might be calm and rational one month, then plunged into despair the next simply because Saturn had entered a new phase. This made self-improvement seem somewhat pointless. Why work on your anger issues when the universe itself might recalibrate you next Tuesday? It fostered a passive, fatalistic approach to mental well-being. While modern psychology studies the intricate patterns of biology, environment, and personal history, medieval psychology studied the ephemeris and said, "Yes, that explains your personality perfectly." And while today we might see astrology as entertainment, medieval society used it as therapy, diagnosis, and the ultimate excuse generator. It was, if nothing else, deeply comforting. Your suffering wasn't random or meaningless. It was cosmically scheduled, part of a vast ancient order. Even your dreams could be explained by planetary influences, adding another layer of celestial interference. But medieval thinkers weren't content to just blame the stars. They also wanted a map of the machine these stars were influencing. So, without ever opening a skull, they proposed another breakthrough. The brain, they declared, was not a mysterious mush. It was a building, a very small, very damp building with 3 neat rooms, each with a designated function. This cell doctrine of brain function, championed by philosophers like Avicenna, stated that the brain was divided into 3 chambers or ventricles. The front ventricle, behind the forehead, was the home of sensus communis or common sense, the place where perceptions from the 5 senses were gathered. The middle ventricle housed imagination and cognition. The rear ventricle was the seat of memory. If you forgot things, your memory chamber was weak or damaged. If you hallucinated, your imagination room was overactive and unsupervised. If you made poor judgments, your frontal reasoning cell was poorly furnished. Mental illness became an interior design problem. Medical texts described these chambers in vivid, architectural detail, despite no one having seen them. They believed that animal spirits, fine, vaporous fluids, flowed through passages connecting these rooms, carrying information. A head injury wasn't just a trauma. It was a wrecking ball that could rearrange your mental floor plan. And of course, this brain house was susceptible to the same old issues. Cold air could make it too moist. Excessive thought could overheat specific rooms. The brain in medieval theory was essentially a poorly insulated cottage with constant drafts and mold issues. This model directly shaped treatment. To improve a weak memory, doctors prescribed herbs and scents believed to strengthen the rear chamber, like rosemary or strong incense. To calm a wild imagination, they advised reducing stimulation, avoiding scary stories, violent images, or too much art. Even education was tailored to this architecture. Learning too much too quickly risked overloading a chamber. Better to memorize slowly, cautiously, and under supervision. A mind bursting with knowledge wasn't admired. It was considered structurally unsound. Modern neuroscience maps billions of neurons and complex networks. Medieval psychology drew a simple 3-room floor plan. And while it sounds absurd now, it gave them a powerful sense of understanding and control. If the mind had a structure, it could be managed, corrected, and repaired. Even if the blueprint was pure imagination, it was a blueprint they believed in completely. Which leads us to the next logical step in their system of control. If the mind was a house and the stars were the weather, then the soul was the landlord. And medieval psychology was about to hand that landlord absolute authority over every thought and feeling. With the brain mapped into imaginary rooms and the stars blamed for your moods, medieval psychology approached its ultimate unifying theory. It wasn't enough to say the mind was influenced by fluids or planets. The final, irrefutable truth was this: the mind, as a separate entity, didn't really exist. What we call mental health was simply a reflection of spiritual alignment. Your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors were inseparable from the state of your soul. If your mind struggled, it meant your soul was out of order. If your emotions overflowed, your soul lacked discipline. If you felt despair, confusion, or anxiety, medieval psychology didn't ask what had happened to you. It asked what you had failed to do for God. This fusion of spirituality and psychology made suffering easy to explain and agonizingly hard to escape. There was no concept of trauma, neurochemistry, or environmental stress as we understand it today. There was only virtue and sin, order and chaos, grace and damnation. The solution to mental distress was not understanding, support, or medical care. The solution was obedience, prayer, repentance, and moral correction. A person hearing voices wasn't experiencing a psychotic episode. They were being tempted by demons or punished for hidden sin. A person sunk in lethargy wasn't depressed. They were guilty of the deadly sin of aesthesia, or spiritual sloth. This belief wrapped every earlier concept into one airtight, inescapable system. Remember black bile melancholy? That was just the physical manifestation of a soul succumbing to despair, a sin against hope. The choleric anger from an overheated liver? That was the bodily flare of the sin of wrath. The lovesickness fever? Evidence of lust or idolatry, placing a human above God. Even the planetary influences were seen as tools of divine providence or, conversely, as avenues for demonic manipulation. Your suffering, therefore, had a sacred purpose. Endurance built virtue. Struggle refined character. Mental pain was not something to remove or alleviate. It was something to survive quietly, learn from, and offer up to God. In a world saturated with religious meaning, this gave profound purpose to suffering. It wasn't random. It wasn't meaningless. But this purpose came at a devastating cost. It pathologized the act of asking for help. Seeking relief could be interpreted as avoiding the spiritual growth God intended through your pain. To complain was to lack faith. To seek a secular explanation was to turn away from divine truth. This framework benefited earthly authorities enormously. If distress was spiritual, then priests, not physicians, held the answers. Obedience to the church became a form of therapy. Submission to your social betters, your lord, your husband, your abbot, became a form of healing. Questioning the system wasn't curiosity. It was rebellion, which was itself a symptom of a sick soul. This created a terrifying feedback loop of guilt and silence. We see this vividly in the treatment of what we'd now call postpartum depression. A woman experiencing crushing sadness after childbirth wouldn't be met with comfort. She would be examined for signs of spiritual failure. Had she resented the pain? Had she been vain during pregnancy? Her melancholy was a moral warning. The treatment was confession, penance, and more prayer. Her suffering was framed not as a medical condition, but as a divine correction. This spiritualization reached its extreme in phenomena like the dancing plagues or mass hysterias of the late Middle Ages. Groups of people would be seized by uncontrollable movements, laughing or screaming. Modern historians might look for explanations in mass psychogenic illness, stress, or ergot poisoning from rotten rye bread. But the medieval world saw it as collective demonic possession or a shared punishment for communal sin. The cure was often brutal public penance and exorcism, rituals that reinforced the idea that the mind was merely a battleground for cosmic forces. This grand unifying theory that mind is soul meant that medieval psychology's final answer to mental distress was essentially, try harder to be holy. It was a psychology with no exit. It offered meaning but denied compassion, provided certainty but forbade inquiry. Modern psychology, in contrast, works to separate the mind, the body, and spiritual belief while understanding how they interact. Medieval psychology fused them into a single moral equation. And while that fusion helped maintain social and religious order in a precarious world, it did so by fundamentally misunderstanding human nature. It turned the profound complexity of the human psyche into a simple ledger of sin and virtue. The medieval world didn't lack intelligence. It lacked the tools and the framework to see the mind as anything other than a spiritual appendage. So it built its explanations from what it had: faith, tradition, authority, and an unshakable confidence in its own rightness. And in doing so, it created a system where to be mentally unwell was to be spiritually suspect, a legacy of silence and stigma that, in some ways, we are still unraveling today. Yet, within this rigid system, a strange and accidental psychological principle did emerge, one that medieval thinkers mastered completely. It wasn't about humors or planets or brain cells. It was about something far more powerful and enduring. It was the principle that confidence, delivered with absolute certainty, can outweigh facts every single time. That's where the real story of medieval popular psychology's lasting impact begins. But before we get to that final revelation, let's pause. If this deep dive into how the past understood the mind is resonating with you, let me know in the comments. Have you ever encountered echoes of these ideas in modern times? And if you're invested in this continuous story, please hit that like button and subscribe. If there's one psychological principle medieval thinkers mastered, even if by accident, it's this: confidence beats correctness. Every time, medieval popular psychology worked not because it was accurate, but because it was delivered with absolute, unshakable certainty. There was no maybe, no, we're still studying this, no, results may vary. Every explanation arrived fully formed, confident, and armored against question. Sad? Black bile. Angry? Hot liver. Confused? Planetary interference. Dream something weird? Spiritual warfare. Struggling mentally? Moral failure. No ambiguity. No uncertainty. Just clean, simple answers. And people clung to those answers. In a world filled with random, terrifying chaos, famine, plague, war, infant mortality, not knowing why you suffered was itself a kind of torture. Certainty was a comfort. So medieval psychology didn't leave space for doubt. It filled every gap with an explanation, especially if the explanation was nonsense, because confident nonsense is much harder to dislodge than hesitant truth. These ideas spread because they were simple, repeatable, and authoritative. You didn't need a medical degree to understand them. Anyone could learn the basics of the four humors. Anyone could point to the sky and blame Saturn. The system was egalitarian in its misunderstanding. And once an idea was accepted, it became self-reinforcing. If a treatment like bloodletting seemed to work, perhaps the patient recovered naturally or the placebo effect took hold, it was proof the theory was correct. If the treatment failed, the failure was blamed on the patient. They hadn't been bled enough. Their sin was too great. The stars were uniquely against them. The system never failed. Only people failed the system. That's not bad science. That's excellent propaganda. This psychology also benefited immensely from the social hierarchy. Knowledge flowed one way, downward from scholars and clergy to everyone else. Questioning wasn't curiosity, it was instability. Doubt itself was a symptom of imbalance. If you questioned why bloodletting cured sadness, you weren't skeptical. You were probably melancholic yourself, your black bile fueling unnatural suspicion. This closed loop of logic made the system virtually unassailable. But here's the uncomfortable, resonant part. This isn't just a medieval story. We like to think we're immune to confident nonsense. We are not. We still gravitate towards simple explanations, neat labels, and theories that tell us exactly who or what is to blame for our pain. We still often prefer the clear lie to the messy, incomplete truth. We still confuse a confident tone with expertise. The medieval world didn't fail because it was stupid. It failed because it was human. Given limited tools, terrifying uncertainty, and an overwhelming need for order, people created explanations that felt right and then defended them with every fiber of their being. Their psychology wasn't primarily about understanding minds. It was about maintaining social order, reducing existential terror, and making random suffering feel meaningful and deserved. So, when we look back and laugh at the idea of draining sadness with leeches or cooling anger with lettuce, we're not just mocking the past. We're seeing a distorted mirror of our own instincts. We have our own humors, we call them neurotransmitters. We have our own celestial blame, we might call it astrology or fate. We have our own moral diagnoses for mental states. The packaging is more sophisticated, but the deep human craving for certainty, for simple cause and effect, for a story that makes sense of our pain, remains unchanged. The legacy of medieval psychology, therefore, isn't a collection of funny old ideas. It's a cautionary tale about the seduction of answers, any answers in the face of fear. It's a reminder that the most powerful force in shaping human belief isn't evidence, but the authority and confidence with which an idea is presented. The medieval mind, in its quest for certainty, built an entire cathedral of thought on a foundation of sand. But they believed in that cathedral so completely that it sheltered generations. In the end, their greatest psychological insight was an unintended one, that the human need for explanation is so profound, we will often choose a confident wrong answer over a hesitant right one. And that insight, more than any theory of black bile or planetary influence, is what truly connects their world to ours. Our story of medieval psychology doesn't end with theories. Collides with human lives, often violently. To see the real-world cost of these confident, made-up systems, we need to step out of the medical textbook and into the muddy, fearful streets of a 15th century village. Here, the fusion of spiritual and psychological theory produced one of history's most chilling phenomena: the witch hunt. The infamous manual for this practice, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, published in 1487, isn't just a superstition. It's a textbook of applied medieval psychology, diagnosing why people, especially women, behaved in abnormal ways. The authors, Heinrich Kramer and James Sprenger, were Dominican monks and theologians. They used the era's psychological principles to build a legal and theological framework for identifying witches. Their logic was a perfect, terrifying marriage of the ideas we've explored. First, the humor theory. Women, being colder and wetter, were considered more impressionable, more susceptible to outside influences, like the devil. Their innate moisture and mental softness made them ideal vessels for demonic possession. A woman who was particularly melancholic, withdrawn, sad, talking to herself, wasn't ill. Her cold, wet constitution had made her a perfect target for a demon's cold influence. Her strange behavior was proof of infestation, not infection. Second, the psychology of dreams and imagination. Vivid dreams, hallucinations, or claims of night flights were not products of a stressed or ill mind. They were evidence that the imagination chamber of the brain had been invaded and taken over by a demon. The witch's confession of flying to a sabbat wasn't a lie or a fantasy. It was a symptom of a spiritually diseased mind, and thus admissible as proof of guilt. Third, and most crucially, the principle that mental suffering equaled moral/spiritual failure. A woman who was eccentric, who argued with her neighbors, who suffered from what we might now call dementia or psychosis, was not a person in need of care. She was a person who had willingly or through weakness entered a pact with Satan. Her very symptoms, confusion, memory loss, erratic speech, were the physical marks of that pact. The witch's mark they searched for on the body was just the physical counterpart to the spiritual stain they already saw on her mind. The interrogations themselves were psychological torture designed to produce confirmatory evidence. Sleep deprivation, a known method, wasn't just about pain. It was a deliberate attempt to break down the rational faculties of the front brain chamber, to induce a state of hallucination and confusion where the accused would no longer be able to distinguish reality from suggestion. When a broken woman finally confessed to consorting with the devil, the inquisitors saw it not as a coerced fantasy, but as the breakthrough of truth finally bursting through her demonic illusions. It was a closed, horrifying loop. Their psychology created the diagnosis, their methods produced the symptoms, and the symptoms confirmed the diagnosis. It's estimated that tens of thousands, mostly women, were executed under this system. This was medieval popular psychology wielding absolute power. It took the speculative ideas about cold, wet women, about imbalanced humors causing strange behavior, and about the soul's health being visible in the mind, and turned them into firewood for the pyre. But the witch hunts are just the most extreme example. A quieter, more institutional application of these beliefs was taking shape in the very concept of the asylum. Places like the Hospital of St. Mary of Bethlehem in London, later infamous as Bedlam, began not as hospitals for healing, but as repositories. The mentally ill were often considered not medically sick, but spiritually broken, morally dangerous, or simply incapable of the reason that defined humanity. They were locked away not for treatment, but for containment, to protect the social and spiritual order. Visiting Bedlam to gawk at the inmates became a popular Sunday pastime for Londoners in the 16th and 17th centuries. The inmates were living exhibits of failed psychology, their cries and gestures seen as proof of their animalistic loss of reason, not as cries for help. This was the logical endpoint of a psychology that saw the mind as a mere reflection of the soul. If the soul was disordered, the person was no longer fully a person. They were a lesson, a warning, or a spectacle. While this grim picture dominated much of Europe, it's crucial to note a contrasting thread, often overlooked. In the Islamic world during the same period, scholars were building on Greek medicine but moving in markedly different psychological directions. Physicians like Al-Razi, Rhazes, and Ibn Sina Avicenna in the 9th to 11th centuries wrote extensively on mental illness. They used humor theory too, but their approach was often more clinical and compassionate. They described conditions like depression, anxiety, and psychosis as illnesses of the brain, not just the soul. They pioneered therapeutic techniques, talking therapies, occupational therapy like music and work, and humane care in specialized wards of hospitals called bimaristans. They believed a disturbed mind could be soothed through reason, calm environment, and gentle treatment. This wasn't a perfect science. They still believed in humors and spirits, but the core philosophy was different. The mind was a complex organ that could become ill and, importantly, could be treated with kindness and method, not just exorcism and punishment. This divergence highlights a profound truth. The medieval period wasn't a monolith of ignorance. It was a battleground of ideas. The brutal, confidence-driven psychology that fueled witch hunts wasn't the only path available. It was the path that won out in certain places because it served the power structures of the time. It enforced religious orthodoxy, social hierarchy, and gender roles with the terrifying force of divine and medical certainty. As we move forward in our story, we'll see how these medieval psychological ghosts, the fusion of mind and morality, the distrust of the different, the search for simple, blame-assigning answers, didn't vanish with the Renaissance. They simply put on new clothes. They would shape the birth of modern asylums, influence early theories of crime and personality, and linger in our stigmas around mental health to this day. The witch hunt was the fire, but the slow, cold ember of medieval psychology was the asylum. To see its true logic, we must visit not the dramatic stake, but the quiet, grim interior of an institution like London's Bethlehem Hospital in the 15th century. Here, the theoretical ideas about mind, soul, and society hardened into a permanent architecture of containment. Bethlehem, founded in 1247, began as a priory but gradually transformed into a specialized repository for the mad. Its popular nickname, Bedlam, would become synonymous with chaos, but its operation was based on a very orderly, medieval set of principles. First, it served a spiritual function. Care, such as it was often administered by religious orders. The insane were seen as souls in profound torment, either being punished by God or besieged by demons. Confinement wasn't primarily for healing, but for custodianship of a person whose reason, the divine spark that separated man from beast, had been extinguished. They were living memento mori, reminders of the soul's fragility. Second, it fulfilled a social function. Medieval communities were small, interdependent, and had little capacity to manage disruptive, non-productive members. The wandering fool or the violently melancholic individual threatened the economic and social stability of a household and a village. The asylum, often funded by charitable bequests from the wealthy seeking heavenly favor, acted as a social overflow tank. It removed the problem from the public sphere, outsourcing charity and control to a specialized institution. The experience inside was shaped by humor theory made manifest. Treatments were the standard evacuations. Bleeding, purging, and blistering applied not with diagnostic nuance, but as routine maintenance, like draining a fouled well. Restraint, chains, manacles, and isolation cells was common. This wasn't seen as cruelty, but as a necessary physical analogy for the internal restraint the patient lacked. If their humors were violently out of balance, external force was needed to impose a semblance of order. The most telling medieval practice, however, was the institution's relationship with the outside world. Starting in the late medieval period, visiting Bethlehem to stare at the inmates became a popular pastime for London citizens. For a penny, you could gawk, laugh, and provoke the chained residents. This was more than morbid entertainment. It was a form of participatory psychology. For the visitor, it reinforced their own sanity and social standing. They were on the correct side of the bars, their humors in balance, their souls ostensibly secure. For the inmate, their existence was reduced to a cautionary spectacle. Their cries were not heard as symptoms of suffering, but as the animalistic noise of a reasonless creature. This practice laid bare the medieval view. The mentally ill were not fully human, but living examples of what happened when the mind's delicate governance failed. They were object lessons in the consequences of sin, imbalance, or cosmic misfortune. Alongside these institutions, a parallel system thrived: the vast, decentralized world of folk psychology. While scholars debated Galen and astrological charts, the peasant in his village relied on a different set of explanations and cures, often blending Christian belief with older pagan remnants. Here, mental distress might be blamed not on black bile, but on elf shot or fairy kidnapping. A sudden panic attack could be diagnosed as a visit from the mare or night hag. Treatments were correspondingly physical and symbolic. A person suffering from what we might call anxiety might be given an amulet of Saint Dymphna, the patron saint of the mentally ill. They might undergo a ritual like passing through, being pulled through a split sapling or a holed stone to symbolically be reborn, free of the clinging spirit. Holy wells dedicated to specific saints were pilgrimage sites for the mentally afflicted, where drinking or bathing in the water was believed to carry curative grace. This folk system was more accessible and often less invasive than the physician's bleedings. It located the cause in the invisible world of spirits and required the intervention of local cunning folk or the church's rituals. It offered a framework that the community understood, integrating the sufferer back into a shared web of meaning, even if the cure was magical. Both the institutional and the folk systems, however different in presentation, shared the core medieval psychological impulse: to explain suffering through a story that reinforced the world's moral and natural order. Whether the story was about demonic pacts, humoral imbalance, or fairy malice, it served to normalize the experience of the well and pathologize the experience of the unwell. The mind was never just a mind. It was a battlefield, a chemical vial, or a haunted house. And in that framework, the person suffering was never just a person in pain. They were a symbol, a lesson, or a problem to be solved by the available tools of story, blade, or prayer. As the medieval period waned, these tools and stories would be passed on. But the institutions they built, like Bethlehem's walls, would stand for centuries. In the next part, we'll examine a surprising counterpoint: the moments when medieval psychology, against its own grain, stumbled towards something resembling insight or compassion. Within the rigid systems of humors and sin, were there glimmers of a more nuanced understanding of the mind? The answer, surprisingly, is yes, but they were often isolated, contradictory, and born from practical necessity rather than theoretical breakthrough. To find them, we must look to the edges of medieval society, to the monastic infirmary, the battlefield, and the marketplace. Consider the monastic tradition. Monasteries were not just spiritual centers. They were de facto hospitals and the closest thing to mental health clinics for the medieval world. The Benedictine rule, which governed countless monastic communities, emphasized moderation, stability, and routine, principles with profound psychological utility. The monk's life was designed to regulate the humors through a balanced diet, regulated sleep, manual labor, labora, and intellectual work, ora. More importantly, the rule demanded self-examination and confession. While the goal was spiritual purification, the process required a monk to articulate his inner states, his temptations, his despondency, aestia, his anger, to a superior. This created a structured space for verbalizing emotional distress, a primitive form of talk therapy that acknowledged the inner world as real and manageable through discipline and community support. For monks who fell into severe melancholy or what we might call psychotic breaks, the treatment was often custodia, protective custody within the infirmary, not a dungeon. They were relieved of duties, given milder work like gardening, and cared for by the brother infirmarian. The cause was still seen as spiritual, a trial from God, demonic temptation. But the response was often practical kindness, a recognition that the afflicted brother could not simply be bled or punished back to sanity. On the battlefield, surgeons developed a crude but pragmatic understanding of traumatic stress. They had no concept of PTSD, but they documented a condition called nostalgia or mal du pays, a debilitating homesickness that could strike mercenaries and soldiers, causing physical decline, indifference, and death. The 14th century French surgeon Guy de Chauliac noted it as a real affliction. The treatment wasn't medical, it was psychological and social. Commanders would try to raise morale with extra pay, speeches, or by fostering unit cohesion. The soldier was sent back to his comrades, not isolated. It was an implicit recognition that the mind could be wounded by experience and needed social, not just physical, healing. Even in the harsh logic of law, we find unexpected nuance. While witch trials pathologized deviation, other legal codes sometimes accounted for mental state. The 13th century English legal treatise Bracton stated that a madman, non compos mentis, could not be held guilty of a crime because he lacked the capacity for criminal intent, much like a wild beast or a child. He was not punished but placed under guard, and his property was protected for his heirs. This was a long way from modern forensic psychology, but it was a legal principle that separated the act from a guilty mind, acknowledging that some individuals existed outside the framework of moral responsibility due to an internal condition. The marketplace of ideas, particularly in the trading hubs of Italy and Spain, also fostered practical psychology. Merchant manuals from the late Middle Ages, like those of Francesco di Marco Dadini, advised traders on managing the stress of risk, debt, and long travels. They recommended techniques we'd now recognize as stress management, maintaining a network of trusted friends, social support, keeping meticulous account books, creating a sense of control, and even moderate wine consumption for anxiety, self-medication, however flawed. This was psychology driven by commerce, not theology, focused on maintaining a functional state of mind for worldly success. Perhaps the most fascinating counterpoint comes from medieval literature and autobiography. In the 12th century, the philosopher and nun Hildegard of Bingen described her own debilitating migraines and visionary states in medical terms, linking her physical suffering to her spiritual insights. She didn't dismiss her experiences as mere humoral imbalance, but saw them as a complex dialogue between body, mind, and divine. Centuries later, the French knight Jean de Joinville, chronicling the Seventh Crusade, gave a blunt, first-hand account of King Louis IX's deep despair after a military defeat. He describes the king's overwhelming grief, his refusal of comfort, his physical collapse. Joinville doesn't diagnose bile or sin. He simply narrates a powerful man broken by events, evoking a raw, human empathy in the reader that bypasses medical theory entirely. These glimmers, monastic care, battlefield observation, legal protection, merchant savvy, and literary empathy, existed in the cracks of the dominant system. They were not a coherent alternative, but they prove that the medieval experience of the mind was not monolithic. Even in an age obsessed with categorization and confident answers, the messy reality of humans suffering forced moments of pause, pragmatism, and sometimes compassion. They remind us that people in the past were not blind to complexity. They just lacked a framework that could prioritize it over order. In the final part of our medieval journey, we'll pull all these threads together to ask the ultimate question. Why did this elegant, confident, and completely wrong system hold such power for 1,000 years? What deep human needs did it satisfy that a more truthful, uncertain psychology could not? We'll seek the answer not in their science, but in their fear. If this exploration is changing how you see the Middle Ages, let me know in the comments. And if you want to hear the conclusion of this strictly medieval story, please like and subscribe. After traversing the landscape of medieval popular psychology, from the theory of black bile to the spectacle of Bedlam, from the witch's pyre to the monk's infirmary, we arrive at the final, most human question. Why? Why did this intricate castle of confidently wrong ideas stand for 1,000 years? The answer lies not in the logic of the system, but in the terrifying void it filled. The medieval world was a world of radical, pervasive uncertainty. Life was ruled by invisible forces. A cough could be a chill or the first sign of the plague. A failed harvest could mean starvation. A noble's whim could spell ruin. In this universe of unseen threats, the greatest terror was not the threat itself, but the not knowing why. The humoral system, for all its flaws, was a masterpiece of explanatory power. It transformed random, terrifying suffering into a problem with a name, a location inside the body, and a procedure. Your child is listless and sad? It is not a mysterious curse or the caprice of God. It is black bile in the spleen. The treatment is brutal, but it is a plan. In a universe that felt morally and physically chaotic, this psychology imposed a brutal, comforting order. It medicalized fate. Furthermore, it was democratically cruel. The system explained the suffering of the poor as readily as the rich. A peasant's rage was an overheated liver. A king's melancholy was an excess of black bile. It created a shared, universal language for human misery that transcended class, binding society in a common understanding of the body's fragility. This shared narrative was a social glue, even as it justified suffering. The system also provided moral and social scaffolding. By linking specific mental states to moral failings, melancholy to sloth, anger to wrath, it integrated psychology directly into the Church's framework of sin and virtue. Your internal state was not private. It was a public indicator of your spiritual health. This made psychology a tool for social control, but for the individual, it also provided a clear path to redemption. Confession, penance, and correction. There was a script for getting better, and it was a script authored by the highest authority imaginable. The psychology's simplicity was its genius. You didn't need literacy to understand that too much heat caused anger. You didn't need a university degree to see a person raving and think, their imagination cell is flooded. The theories were visually intuitive, the idea of draining a poison, cooling a fire, balancing scales. This made them powerfully sticky, transmitted easily through proverbs, sermons, and popular art. They became common sense. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the system was unfalsifiable to the people within it. Its logic was circular and self-reinforcing. If a treatment worked, it proved the theory. If it failed, the failure was explained away. The patient was too far gone, the planets were malign, the sin was too deep. The system never failed. Reality was simply blamed for not conforming to it. This intellectual trap is the most enduring legacy of medieval psychology. It teaches us that the most persuasive systems are not necessarily the most accurate, but the most psychologically satisfying. They offer clarity in place of confusion, agency in place of helplessness, and meaning in place of chaos. The medieval mind, facing a dark and unpredictable world, built a lantern of explanation. The light it cast was distorted, often casting monstrous shadows, but it was light nonetheless. To turn it off would have meant standing in the dark, acknowledging that the tremors of the soul might have no cause they could understand, no cure they could administer. That was a darkness more frightening than any bleeding bowl or purgative. So they held fast to their lantern. In doing so, they gave us a timeless lesson about the human condition. We will often cling to a confident wrong answer longer than we will wrestle with a hesitant truth. The story of medieval psychology, therefore, is not a museum of curiosities. It is a mirror. It shows us our own deep-seated hunger for stories that make sense of our pain, our own tendency to confuse authority with truth, and our own vulnerability to simple, elegant lies in the face of complex, terrifying realities. Their world is gone. Their science is obsolete. But the psychological needs that built their system are, in many ways, still our own. Thank you for joining this exploration of the medieval mind. To understand medieval psychology in its most intimate, daily form, we must leave the physician's chamber and step into the kitchen. For the medieval mind, food was not just fuel. It was pharmacology. Every bite was a calculated intervention in the humoral balance of the body, a direct tool for manipulating temperament, mood, and even moral character. This was the science of dietetics, and it turned the dinner table into the front line of mental hygiene. The logic was precise, stemming from ancient authorities like Galen, but elaborated in countless medieval regimens of health. All foods were classified by their essential qualities, their degree of heat, cold, moisture, and dryness. These qualities directly opposed or corrected the qualities of the humors. The goal of a meal was not merely pleasure, but homeostasis. Let's take a melancholic person, burdened by cold, dry black bile. Their prescribed diet aimed to introduce warmth and moisture. They were to avoid foods that were drying or cooling, old meats, hard cheeses, lentils, and most root vegetables. Instead, they were to eat hot and moist foods to counteract the melancholy. This meant tender, young meats like lamb or kid, sweet wines, ripe fruits like figs and dates, and vegetables like spinach. Even the cooking method mattered. Boiling was considered moistening, while roasting was drying. A melancholic noble might be served a stew of young chicken with prunes and saffron, a warm spice, washed down with a sweet Malmsey wine, all carefully chosen to flood his system with warm, moist qualities and dissolve the clinging black bile. Conversely, a choleric person, aflame with hot, dry yellow bile, needed a cooling, moistening diet. They were to shun all heating foods, garlic, onions, pepper, red meat, and strong wine. Their plate would feature cold and moist items, cucumbers, lettuce, white fish like sole, barley bread, and goat's milk. Their drink might be well-watered wine or a light beer. The goal was to douse the internal fire, not to starve it. This system applied to everyone, but with starkly different menus based on class. A peasant suffering from what we might call stress or agitation had few options. His coarse rye bread, salted pork, and onions were all considered heating and drying, the worst possible diet for a choleric temperament. His food, shaped by poverty and preservation, likely exacerbated his humoral imbalances. His treatment was often just more of the same hard labor, which was believed to burn off excess heat through sweat. The wealthy, however, could afford a tailored cuisine. Elaborate dietetic manuals were written for them. The 14th century Tequinum Sanitatis, a beautifully illustrated guide, lists hundreds of items with their humoral effects and the specific bodily and mental states they corrected. Eating was a daily, conscious act of psychological self-regulation. This belief extended to more than just mood. Diet was thought to directly influence cognition and morality. Students preparing for intense study were advised to eat moistening foods like almonds and eggs to prevent their brains from overheating and drying out. Soldiers before battle might be given heating meats and spices to stoke their courage, linked to heat and blood. A person prone to lechery, a hot and moist sin, might be prescribed a cooling, drying diet to dampen their passions. The kitchen, therefore, was an annex of the pharmacy and the confessional. It also created a pervasive anxiety around eating. To eat the wrong food for your temperament, or in the wrong season, summer demanded cool foods, winter warm ones, was to invite illness of both body and mind. Gluttony was a sin not just of excess, but of humoral sabotage. This worldview made the medieval relationship with food deeply psychological. A craving was not just a preference, it was a diagnostic sign. A desire for salty, dry foods might indicate a buildup of phlegm. A longing for sweets could signal a melancholic need for warmth. The act of eating was a constant, silent dialogue with one's internal climate. While this system seems labyrinthine to us, it provided a tangible sense of control. In a world where emotions felt like weather systems moving through the soul, you could at least control the weather in your pantry. It personalized medicine and psychology in a way bloodletting could not. It was a daily participatory therapy. Of course, it was based on a complete misunderstanding of nutrition and physiology. But its legacy is profound. It embedded the idea that mind and body are inextricably linked through what we consume, a principle modern science confirms, even as it demolishes the humoral details. The medieval person, carefully choosing a salad to cool his temper, was performing an act of self-care based on the best psychological science he had. It was wrong, but it was not stupid. It was an attempt to bring order, bite by carefully classified bite, to the mysterious tumult within. Next, we'll venture into a darker corner of this applied psychology, the medieval diagnosis of supernatural possession and how it differed, and often tragically didn't, from the diagnosis of natural madness. In the medieval world, the most terrifying psychological diagnosis was not melancholy or choler. It was the verdict that a person's mind was not ill, but invaded. The line between natural madness, caused by humoral imbalance, and supernatural possession, caused by demonic inhabitation, was the thinnest and most dangerous line in medieval psychology. Getting it wrong meant the difference between a physician's purgative and a priest's exorcism, between the infirmary and the stake. So how did they tell the difference? Medieval scholars, drawing from early church fathers like Augustine and later authorities, established a complex set of diagnostic criteria. The key was to look for signs that the affliction exceeded the natural capacity of the humors. A person raving from a high fever might speak nonsense. That was a natural heat drying the brain. But if that person displayed preternatural strength, levitated, spoke in a language they had never learned, or exhibited a violent revulsion to sacred objects like holy water or the Eucharist, The cause was suspected to be supernatural. These were signs that an intelligence, alien and hostile, was wielding the body. The Malleus Maleficarum dedicates lengthy sections to this differential diagnosis. The authors argue that while a melancholic might believe they are a wolf, a condition called lycanthropy, a demoniac might actually cause others to perceive them as a wolf through illusion. The distinction was in the effect on observers and the presence of marvels beyond nature's laws. But in the anxious, charged atmosphere of a village, this clinical distinction often collapsed. A peasant family witnessing a member's sudden, violent psychosis, screaming blasphemies, thrashing with inhuman force, were far more likely to see the hand of the devil than an excess of yellow bile. Local priests, not university-trained physicians, were usually the first responders. Their manuals, like the Rituale Romanum, provided tests. They might place a consecrated object near the afflicted. A fit of rage was evidence of demonic presence. A calm response suggested natural illness. The problem was, a person in the throes of mania or catatonia could react violently to any stimulus, easily misinterpreted as a demon's recoil from the holy. The consequences of a supernatural diagnosis were profound. Natural madness called for medical treatment. Diet, bleeding, herbs, and restraint. Demonic possession called for spiritual warfare. Fasting, prayer, pilgrimage, and exorcism. The exorcism rite itself was a brutal psychological and physical ordeal. The possessed was often restrained. The exorcist would command the demon in Latin, press relics against the body, and demand the entity reveal its name and purpose. The process could last for days, involving screams, convulsions, and exhaustion. If it worked, and the person became calm, it was a miracle. If it failed, the demon was deemed particularly stubborn, or worse, the possibility of witchcraft. A voluntary pact with the devil was raised, which could lead to judicial torture and execution. This created a horrific double bind for the mentally ill, especially women, who were considered more susceptible to demonic influence due to their weaker physical and moral constitution. Symptoms of what we might now identify as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or epileptic psychosis perfectly mirrored the signs of possession. The very violence of their illness became proof of its supernatural origin, ensuring they received the most traumatic treatment imaginable. There were voices of caution. Some learned physicians and even clerics argued that many cases deemed possession were actually severe melancholy. They noted that the imagination, when overheated and corrupted by black bile, could produce vivid fantasies of demonic contact and provoke blasphemous thoughts that the sufferer could not control. To them, the demoniac was often a profoundly melancholic person whose diseased brain was crafting its own torment. But these were minority opinions, struggling against a more compelling narrative. For the community, a diagnosis of possession served a powerful social function. It externalized evil. It explained sudden, violent chaos not as a random failure of a neighbor's brain chemistry, but as the result of a clear, malicious agent. It allowed the community to unite against a defined enemy, the demon, through shared ritual. It was, in a twisted sense, more comforting than accepting that the mind could break on its own, for no reason. The tragedy of this blurred line is immeasurable. It meant that for centuries, some of the most severely mentally ill people were subjected to rituals designed to address a supernatural entity, often exacerbating their trauma and pain, while the natural roots of their suffering went unaddressed. It stands as the darkest example of how medieval psychology, when its theoretical frameworks met raw human fear, could abandon even its own flawed medicine in favor of a story that made terrifying sense to the community, regardless of the cost to the individual. Among the most vivid and haunting psychological conditions described in the Middle Ages was lycanthropy, the delusion that a person had transformed into or believed themselves to be a wolf. This was not the folklore of werewolves under a full moon, but a clinical diagnosis found in medical texts. It serves as a perfect case study of how medieval psychology attempted to categorize a severe mental break using its humoral toolkit, while simultaneously brushing against the supernatural fears of the community. The medieval physician's explanation was strictly naturalistic, if bizarre. Lycanthropy was considered an extreme form of melancholy. The theory, as detailed by authorities like Paul of Aegina and later medieval compilers, went like this. An overabundance of particularly thick, cold, and viscous black bile could overwhelm the brain. This specific bile produced a chilling, drying effect so severe that it corrupted the central faculty of imagination, housed in the middle ventricle. The patient's imaginativa, now poisoned and frozen, became fixated on bestial imagery. Most commonly the wolf, a creature of solitude, violence, and melancholy landscapes. The sufferer did not physically transform, but their corrupted imagination so overpowered their common sense that they believed they had. Their behavior followed this belief. Medical texts describe the lycanthrope as pale, with dry eyes and a terrible thirst, signs of the dry humor. Prone to wandering cemeteries and lonely woods, the haunts of melancholy, and given to howling and walking on all fours. They were reported to have a hollow, staring gaze and to be especially active in the winter, the cold, dry season. The treatment prescribed was straight from the standard melancholic playbook, but intensified. Massive bloodletting to drain the morbid bile, warm, moist baths to counteract the cold dryness, and a diet of warm, moist foods like fatty meats and sweet wines. The goal was to literally melt and wash away the psychic frost that had trapped the mind in a bestial form. However, this clean medical diagnosis existed in constant tension with popular and ecclesiastical belief. To a village, a man found crawling in the forest, growling, with torn clothes and bloody hands from hunting animals raw, was not a melancholic. He was a werewolf, either a witch who had magically assumed a wolf's shape or a person cursed by the devil. This was a supernatural crime, not a medical condition. The legal and theological consequences were severe. In numerous medieval trials, particularly in France and the Holy Roman Empire, people were accused of being werewolves. Confessions, often extracted under torture, detailed pacts with the devil and magical ointments. These werewolves were often executed as witches. The psychological reality behind these cases was likely a mixture of severe mental illness, perhaps combined with extreme poverty, malnutrition, and social isolation that led to feral behavior. The tragedy of lycanthropy lies in this diagnostic fork in the road. A physician might see a humoral imbalance. Inquisitors saw demonic witchcraft. Which authority prevailed often depended on who got to the sufferer first, and the local climate of fear. The case of lycanthropy reveals something profound about the medieval mind's view of humanity. It demonstrated a fear that the boundary between human and beast was fragile, maintained only by the delicate balance of humors and the grace of God. If the mind's governance slipped, a person could conceptually, and in their own experience, slide back down the chain of being. The wolf was not a random symbol. It represented the untamed, the violent, the non-human lurking just beneath the skin of reason. This condition also highlighted the limits of the humoral system. By reducing such a profound psychotic break to cold, dry bile, the medical model struggled to explain the specific narrative content of the delusion. Why a wolf? The system could only answer with more qualities, because wolves are melancholy animals, and the bile was melancholic. It was a circular, descriptive explanation, not a penetrating one. Ultimately, the history of lycanthropy is a story of two competing medieval psychologies clashing over a single broken human being. One, grounded in Galenic tradition, saw a body in need of correction. The other, grounded in a worldview alive with invisible spiritual warfare, saw a soul in need of saving or destroying. The person at the center, lost in a wolf-shaped hell of their own mind, was rarely seen as a person at all. They were a humoral equation or a demonic vessel. In both cases, the humanity of their profound suffering was the first thing to be devoured. Next, we'll turn from these dark forests to the structured world of medieval learning to examine how the universities themselves taught psychology. What did a medieval student actually learn about the mind in the lecture halls of Paris or Bologna? If you're finding these specific case studies illuminating, let me know in the comments. And if you want to continue this education in medieval thought, please like and subscribe. To see medieval psychology in its most formal, systematic guise, we must step into the lecture halls of its great universities: Paris, Bologna, Oxford, and Salerno. Here, the theories that trickled down to barber surgeons and village priests were codified, debated, and passed on to the next generation of learned elites. The curriculum was not called psychology, of course. It was woven into the study of physica, natural philosophy, and, most importantly, medicina. The foundational text for all medical and psychological learning was the Articella, a collection of ancient and Arabic works that formed the core of the medical curriculum from the 12th century onward. At its heart were the works of Galen and Hippocrates, as interpreted and expanded by the Persian polymath Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna. His monumental canon of medicine was the ultimate textbook. A student's psychological education began with rote memorization of the humoral system, not as a theory, but as fact. He would learn the four qualities, the four humors, the four temperaments, and their countless correlations to seasons, ages, planets, and organs. This was the basic grammar of the human condition. Then came the study of the faculties of the soul, a blend of Aristotelian philosophy and Galenic medicine. The student learned that the soul had three primary faculties: the vegetative, growth, nutrition; the sensitive, sensation, motion; and the rational, intellect, reason. Psychology was largely concerned with the malfunctions of the sensitive and rational faculties, which were housed in the brain and governed by the flow of pneuma or spiritus, a fine, vaporous substance distilled from blood and air. Lectures would focus on the brain's ventricles. Using detailed, schematic diagrams, the master would teach that the front ventricle processed sensation, the middle ventricle was where imagination and cognition occurred, and the rear ventricle stored memory. Mental illness was understood as a blockage, corruption, or imbalance in the flow of spirits through these chambers. A failing memory was a problem in the rear storehouse. Hallucinations meant the middle chamber was producing images without input from the senses. The pedagogy was one of authoritative commentary. The master would read a passage from Avicenna's canon or Galen's on the affected parts, and then explicate it line by line. Debate was encouraged, but within strict boundaries. One could question the interpretation of Avicenna, but not the fundamental truth of his framework. A student arguing that black bile might not exist would have been not just wrong, but incomprehensible. Practical application was taught through concilia, written case consultations. A master would present a hypothetical or real case. A merchant, aged 40, of choleric temperament, suffers from insomnia, violent dreams, and sudden fits of rage after a business loss. The students would then devise a regimen. Their answer would follow a strict formula: identify the likely humoral imbalance, excess of hot, dry yellow bile, prescribe a cooling, moistening diet, lettuce, cucumber, fish, recommend cooling activities, listening to calm music, walking by water, and finally, outline medical interventions: bleeding from the liver vein, a cooling poultice on the forehead. The exercise trained them to apply a rigid system to the infinite variety of human suffering. Crucially, the curriculum also included what we would call psychosomatic medicine. Students learned that strong emotions could cause humoral shifts. A sudden fright could cool the blood, causing illness. Prolonged sorrow could generate black bile. Therefore, part of a physician's duty was to manage a patient's emotional environment, to provide reassurance, suggest distractions, or even prescribe travel. This acknowledged a powerful link between mind and body, even if the causal arrow was drawn backwards by our standards. The university also framed the limits of medical psychology. Conditions deemed purely spiritual, like outright demonic possession, were ceded to the theology faculty. But the line was contested. Medical students might learn that some cases of possession were actually frenzy from an overheated brain, a subtle argument for medical over clerical authority. This education produced a highly literate, self-confident medical elite who saw the mind as a complex but decipherable mechanical system. Their psychology was logical, comprehensive, and utterly divorced from empirical reality as we know it. It gave them a powerful tool for diagnosis and a coherent story to tell patients, which in itself had therapeutic value. The graduate left the university armed not with curiosity about the unknown, but with the formidable certainty that he already possessed the keys to the human psyche. That certainty, stamped with the authority of the university degree, would govern his practice for a lifetime and ensure the stability of the medieval psychological model for centuries. Beyond the Latin lectures of the university lay a vast, vibrant, and largely oral world of psychological knowledge and practice, the domain of women. While excluded from formal medical degrees, women were central to the daily psychology of the medieval household and community, acting as healers, caregivers, and repositories of folk wisdom. Their understanding of the mind was less about Galenic ventricles and more about balance, spirits, and the practical magic of everyday life. For the vast majority of people, especially the poor, the first response to anxiety, sadness, or a child's night terrors was not a physician but the woman of the house or the local wise woman. Their framework blended Christian belief, remnants of pagan folklore, humoral concepts filtered down through popular culture, and hard-won empirical observation. A mother calming a hysterical child might use techniques we'd recognize as sensory regulation, swaddling for security, humming a lullaby, or administering a mild sedative tea of chamomile or poppy syrup. She understood that fright could curdle the blood or unsettle the spirits, phrases that echoed humoral theory in folk idiom. Her goal was to restore warmth and equilibrium, often through ritual as much as remedy. The village wise woman or cunning folk was a key psychological figure. She treated the falling sickness, epilepsy, the mother, hysterical suffocation, and maladies of the spirit like sudden melancholy or panic. Her methods were holistic. For a person suffering from what we might call depression, she might prescribe a regimen that included a cleansing bath with certain herbs, like St. John's wort, later known as a modern antidepressant, a protective amulet to wear, a prayer to St. Dymphna, and a directive to avoid certain foods or places. This approach treated the mind, body, and spirit as a single unit, addressing the sufferer's fear and social context as directly as their symptoms. Much of women's psychological practice was preventive and dietary, operating within the humoral model but applied intuitively. They managed the family's diet to keep temperaments in check, serving cooling salads in summer to prevent choleric outbursts, preparing warming stews in winter to ward off melancholic lethargy. This daily, domestic management of mood through food was a powerful, if uncredited, form of psychological care. However, women's own mental health was viewed through the most restrictive lens of medieval theory. Their supposed cold, wet, and porous nature made them, in the eyes of learned male physicians, psychologically vulnerable. The wandering womb, hystera, was believed to cause a suite of symptoms: suffocation, emotional volatility, convulsions, lumped under the term hysteria. Treatment aimed to lure the womb back into place with sweet smells at the nose or foul ones at the vagina, or through marriage and pregnancy to anchor it. This biological fatalism was used to explain and dismiss women's emotional expressions as mere physiology. Furthermore, the female capacity for deep emotion and visionary experience was a double-edged sword. A woman like Hildegard of Bingen could channel her visions into respected theological works. But an ordinary woman with intense spiritual fervor or vivid dreams could easily be suspected of melancholy, hysteria, or worse, demonic influence. The line between a holy mystic and a madwoman was perilously thin and often determined by male clerical authority. When women stepped outside the role of informal healer and into more public practice, they risked severe backlash. A woman who successfully treated mental suffering with her own blends and rituals could be acclaimed as a healer. But in times of social panic, the same knowledge could see her accused of witchcraft. Her understanding of herbs for calming or inducing visions could be reinterpreted as making devilish potions. Her intuitive psychological insights could be framed as a malicious evil eye or a power gained from Satan. The wise woman's psychology was thus practiced under a constant shadow of suspicion. The system women navigated was fundamentally contradictory. They were tasked with maintaining the psychological well-being of their families using a blend of wisdom and folkloric belief, while their own mental states were pathologized by a scholarly system that considered them inherently unstable. They provided care within a framework that denied them formal authority and could, at any moment, criminalize their expertise. This dynamic reveals that medieval psychology was not one system, but two: a written, male, theoretical psychology of the schools, and an oral, often female, practical psychology of the hearth and village. They coexisted, borrowing from each other, but with a profound power imbalance. The university graduate had the authority of texts. The wise woman had the authority of results. And in the dangerous gap between them, the minds and bodies of medieval women were constantly being diagnosed, treated, and judged. In the medieval world, sleep was not a passive void, but an active, vulnerable, and diagnostically crucial state. The psychology of sleep and dreams reveals a deeply held belief that the mind, when the body's guard was down, became a transparent window to one's physical health and spiritual standing. To have a good night's rest meant more than feeling refreshed. It was a sign of humoral equilibrium and a soul at peace. Medieval sleep science began with digestion. It was believed that during sleep, the body's innate heat retreated inward to concentrate on concocting, cooking, and transforming the food in the stomach. Vapors from this digestive process, called fumes or exhalations, rose to the brain. The quality of these vapors determined the quality of sleep and dreams. Light, well-cooked vapors from a temperate, moderate meal produced quiet, restorative sleep and pleasant, forgettable dreams. Heavy, uncooked vapors from gluttony or melancholic vapors from indigestible foods would cloud the brain, leading to fitful sleep, nightmares, and morning grogginess, which was seen as literal fog in the head. Therefore, sleep hygiene was primarily dietary. Medical regimens, like the popular Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, gave strict advice: eat light suppers, avoid melancholic foods like beans and old cheese before bed, and sleep propped up to aid the ascent of vapors. The sleeping environment mattered too. A moderately cool, dry room was best to prevent the brain from becoming too moist from night air. Dreams, however, were the main event. They were not random. They were classified into three main types, a schema borrowed from late antiquity. First, the somnium naturale, natural dream, caused directly by the humoral state. A choleric person, full of heat, might dream of fire and conflict. A melancholic person would dream of darkness, graves, and solitude. These dreams were diagnostic tools for the physician. A patient reporting constant dreams of drowning might indicate an overmoist brain, calling for drying treatments. Second, the somnium animale, dream of the soul, sparked by the day's preoccupations. The cobbler dreaming of shoes, the anxious lover dreaming of their beloved. These were considered less medically significant, but revealed the state of one's imagination and passions. Third, and most weighty, the somnium coalesced or oraculum, celestial or prophetic dream, believed to be sent by God, angels, or demons. This category caused the most anxiety. Distinguishing a divine vision from a demonic trick or a mere melancholic phantasm was a constant problem for theologians and individuals alike. Monasteries kept detailed dream diaries for this purpose, to be reviewed with a spiritual director. A dream's content was scoured for symbolic meaning, often using dream interpretation manuals that provided lists. Dreaming of losing a tooth could mean the loss of a friend or vitality. Dreaming of flying could signify spiritual aspiration or dangerous pride. The psychological impact was profound. Waking from a vivid, terrifying nightmare wasn't just unsettling. It was a data point about your physical and spiritual health. It could prompt a visit to a healer for a purgative to clear the corrupt humors causing the bad dreams, or to a confessor to examine one's conscience for the sin that might have invited a demonic visitor. This belief system pathologized the normal variability of sleep. Insomnia was not just sleeplessness. It was a sign that the brain was too dry or too preoccupied with fumes from anxiety. Excessive sleep, lethargy, signaled an overabundance of cold, moist phlegm drowning the brain's faculties. Both conditions required corrective regimens. For the medieval mind, the sleeping person was in a state of heightened transparency. The conscious faculty of reason was offline, allowing the body's inner workings and the spirit's whispers to surface in the theater of dreams. Therefore, managing sleep was a key part of managing mental health. It was a time when the body's kitchen had to work right, and the soul's door had to be guarded. A peaceful night proved your life was in order, physically and morally. A troubled night was an early warning system, a call to adjust your diet, your prayers, or both. The medieval courtroom was a brutal theater where the abstract theories of mind met the concrete consequences of law. Here, the question was not merely did he do it, but with what mind did he do it? The answer, drawn from the era's psychological principles, could mean the difference between a fine, a pardon, or the gallows. Medieval law, a patchwork of canon law, Roman law, and local custom, grappled imperfectly with mental state. The foundational concept was mens rea, the guilty mind. But how could one assess the guilt of a mind believed to be governed by fluids, planets, and spiritual forces? Legal scholars and judges relied on a blend of humoral psychology, common observation, and folk belief to make these determinations. The primary legal category for the mentally incapacitated was non compos mentis, not in sound mind. This was not a medical diagnosis, but a social and legal judgment of incompetence. A person deemed non compos mentis could not manage property, make a will, or stand trial in the normal way. But proving this state required evidence that aligned with popular psychology. Courts looked for visible behavioral signs. Was the person prone to wild, unprovoked laughter or tears? Did they wander aimlessly, naked or poorly clothed, oblivious to shame or danger? Could they recognize family members or recall their own name? These were the medieval equivalents of a psychological evaluation, testing the integrity of memory, reason, and social awareness, the very faculties housed in the brain's ventricles. Crucially, the cause of the madness mattered. Natural madness, arising from humoral imbalance, like melancholy or frenzy, might earn pity and custodial protection. The individual's property would be managed by a guardian, and they might be confined to their home or handed over to family. However, madness believed to be supernatural in origin, demonic possession, or witchcraft, was a different matter. Here, the individual was often seen as an active agent of evil, either voluntarily or through vulnerability, and fell under ecclesiastical or secular anti-witchcraft law, where the outcome was often execution. The most perilous psychological line was between madness and badness. A hot-tempered man who killed in a fight might be judged as having a choleric imbalance, a mitigating factor that could reduce a murder charge to manslaughter, perhaps resulting in a fine or exile rather than death. His crime was an excess of a natural humor, not pure malice. But a cold, premeditated murder indicated a different humoral profile, a dry, calculating melancholy or a fundamentally corrupt nature, and was treated with maximum severity. This system placed tremendous power in the hands of the community and the judge. Witness testimony about a person's long-standing eccentricities, their family's reputation, and their behavior before and after the crime shaped the psychological narrative. A wealthy person might have physicians testify to their melancholic constitution. A poor, isolated individual with the same symptoms might be seen as simply vicious or touched by the devil. The legal process itself could become a psychological test. Ordeals, though declining after the 12th century, were based on the idea that God would protect the innocent by performing a miracle. The psychology at play was one of divine intervention directly into the physical world, bypassing human judgment of the mind. Similarly, compurgation, swearing an oath with oath helpers, tested the strength of one's social and spiritual credit, a kind of communal assessment of character. By the later Middle Ages, with the rise of professional judges and lawyers, more formal rules emerged. English common law, for instance, held that a madman should not be punished because he could not have felonious intent, akin to a wild beast. But he could still be detained for safety. This legal principle, while humane in sparing life, still framed the mentally ill as non-human, as creatures outside the legal and moral community. The intersection of psychology and law thus reveals a stark truth. In the Middle Ages, your mind was not your own private domain. Its perceived state was a matter of public record and legal consequence. The theories of scholars provided a language for explaining deviance, but in the gritty arena of the court, that language was used to justify outcomes that ranged from merciful protection to brutal elimination. It was a system that sought order above understanding, using the best psychological tools of the age to sort the accountable from the helpless, the human from the beast, and the ill from the evil. After this long journey through the medieval mind, from the four humors to the witch trials, from the monastic infirmary to the royal courtroom, we arrive at a final vantage point. What are we to make of this vast, intricate, and profoundly mistaken system? The legacy of medieval popular psychology is not a list of discarded curiosities. It is a set of deep cultural reflexes about how we explain suffering and judge character. Its ghosts do not haunt our medical textbooks, but they still whisper in our courtrooms, our slang, and our stigmas. The most enduring relic is our language. We still speak of being in good or bad humor. We vent our spleen. We are sanguine about prospects or phlegmatic in response. These are not dead metaphors. They are fossilized psychology, shaping how we visualize emotions as internal substances or climates. The medieval instinct to physicalize the mind persists in our own search for biological markers for mental illness. We have swapped black bile for serotonin, but the desire for a tangible, single cause remains a powerful, and sometimes reductive, narrative. The fusion of mind and morality, so absolute in the Middle Ages, has proven incredibly durable. While we no longer blame demonic possession, we often conflate mental illness with moral failing. The notion that depression is a lack of willpower, that addiction is a choice, that anxiety is a failure to cope, these are secular echoes of the medieval belief that a troubled mind indicated a disordered soul. Our legal systems still wrestle with the same core problem medieval judges faced: where to draw the line between a broken brain and a bad person. The concept of not guilty by reason of insanity is the direct, evolved descendant of the non-compos mentis defense. We have better tools for assessment, but the fundamental struggle to assign blame, compassion, or containment in the shadow of mental disturbance is unchanged. Perhaps the deepest legacy is the medieval lesson about the function of psychology itself. Their system was not designed primarily to heal. It was designed to explain, to control, and to maintain social order. It pathologized nonconformity, reinforced hierarchy, and provided a coherent story for random misery. In doing so, it satisfied a profound human need, the need for meaning. A world where sadness is caused by black bile is a frightening world, but it is a world that makes sense. It is a world with answers. We have not lost that craving. We see it in every new, confident pop psychology fad that promises to label and fix the human condition with a simple formula. The medieval period teaches us to be wary of psychological systems that are too elegant, too confident, and too perfectly aligned with the existing power structures. The ultimate takeaway is not that our ancestors were foolish. They were brilliantly inventive within the confines of their knowledge. They observed the world closely and built a logical, comprehensive model to explain it. They were wrong, but they were not irrational. Their story is a humbling reminder that our own most cherished psychological truths, the frameworks we use to understand ourselves today, might one day look just as peculiar and contingent as the theory of the four humors. The study of medieval psychology, therefore, is not an exercise in superiority. It is an exercise in empathy and vigilance. It asks us to look at our own certainties and ask, what are our humors? What are our invisible fluids and celestial influences? And what suffering might we, in our own confident age, be misunderstanding? Thank you for joining this exploration of a world where the mind was a castle of fluids, a battleground for angels and demons, and a mirror of the cosmos. It was a world that got almost everything wrong, but in its struggle to make sense of the human heart, it revealed truths about fear, hope, and the eternal search for answers that are, in the end, very much our own. If this series has given you a new lens on the past, and perhaps the present, I'd love to hear your final reflections in the comments. If you found value in this deep dive, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with anyone who loves history, psychology, or simply a great story about how people try to understand themselves. The past is never really past. It's the foundation we stand on, even when we don't know it's there.